Hi, welcome to my studio. My name is Luisa and I'm a watercolor floral artist from Italy, also the founder of the Lulu Blue Studio, where I paint loose style flower compositions in watercolor, and I also teach beginner artists how to paint florals in loose style. I am so excited to be here today and partner with Amatruda to show you how you can paint these loose style flowers in watercolor on their beautiful paper. First thing, I'm going to tell you all the supplies that you are going to use for this painting. For the paper, we will be using this Amatruda sheet that is 100% cotton, cold press, with a smooth surface. Its high quality allows me to use a lot of water without problems, and I love how it helps create beautiful blends of colors. For the brushes, you can use any brush you have at your disposal. I recommend using a filbert brush for the flowers, and then to create the leaves, a round brush in thick size and a round brush in thinner size to create some layers onto the leaves. For the paints, you can use any watercolor you have at your disposal. I will also be using a little bit of gouache just because I will want some areas to be a little bit more hiding than using just the watercolor paints. But I will explain everything in this tutorial. Let's start painting together. We are going to start painting this watercolor flower composition by painting the main hero flower in the center of this page. I'm going to mix on my color palette my favorite colors, transparent orange and quinacridone magenta, and I'm going to create this flower using a filbert brush. I'm going to create the petals of this flower using a concentrated amount of pigment on the brush. Since I have used quite a lot of orange, in my case the base of these petals is going to be orange in color, but then I will take with the brush some more concentrated quinacridone magenta and orange, and I started to create some additional brush strokes to highlight some areas of these petals. The central part of this flower is still empty because I'm going to add in a second moment the center. When I'm satisfied with the shape of this flower, I start to remove from my brush the excessive amount of pigment, and I started to create petals of secondary flowers all around the main hero flower. To create this flower composition, we wanted to highlight the hero flower in the center, and for this reason the hero flower in the center has a concentrated amount of pigment all over the petals. For all of the secondary flowers instead, we are going to use mainly water to create the base of the petals, and then using some more concentrated pigment like quinacridone magenta or transparent orange, I add brush strokes that are going to travel on the surface of the paper through the wet on wet technique. You can use any color you like to add these brush strokes, and they are going to create a different effect on the petals of these secondary flowers compared to the effect that we have created on the central hero flower. High quality papers like this one from Amatruda, which is in 100% cotton, allows you to really play with the wet on wet technique, and also to play with a different ratio of pigment and water when you create your florals. Just have fun and use this moment to create flowers with this technique and experiment with different concentration of pigment and water while you're creating the petals of your main elements. I have decided to place the secondary flowers all around the hero flower that is in the center part of this composition, and therefore all of these secondary flowers are slightly smaller in size and also frame the hero flower in the center and give to the whole composition a sort of flow that starts from the upper left corner in this page and go down to this page to the right corner of this Amatruda paper. At this point, I look at the composition as a whole, and I really like what I've created, but I want the hero flower to stand out. And for this reason, I take a little bit more transparent orange and quinacridone magenta, and I add a few brush strokes of very concentrated color into the petals of the hero flower. The petals of the hero flower are still wet, and therefore when I add these brush strokes, which are very concentrated in color, will allow these petals to really be highlighted compared to all of the other petals of the other flowers. At this point, I leave these flowers to dry and I change my brush. I take my round brush in size 12 and I play with water, creating the base of what are going to be the stems and the leaves of this composition. Basically, in this first phase, I'm just playing with water, with clean water, and I create what are going to become the stems and the leaves of this composition. I create first some lines that are going to become stems, and then I start to create some leaves just using water and the belly of my brush. Then I mix on my color palette a little bit of green. In my case, I'm mixing sap green with a little bit of transparent orange and a little bit of quinacridone magenta to create a type of green that is a little bit more muted. And I go over the areas where I painted the layer of just water with the brush. In this way, I'm going to create some leaves that are going to be very soft in shape, and we are going to have some gradients of pigment where some areas are going to have some more concentrated pigment and they are going to be darker, while some other areas are going to be much lighter. And using this technique, I keep adding other leaves, just using mainly water and just a little amount of green all around these flowers. I want to add these leaves in areas around the main flower and around the secondary flowers that I've created in first place. And therefore I look at this composition and I place these leaves mainly in areas that are sort of framing all of the flowers that I've created in first place. I pay attention to create some leaves that are a little bit darker than others, and I like to add to these leaves, when they are still wet, some more concentrated and darker color like cobalt green dark, which is a little bit darker compared to the sap green, to the leaves that are still wet. In this way, the cobalt green dark will blend on the surface of the paper with the sap green of the first layer, and by the time the composition is going to be completely dry, these two colors will create beautiful blends. I keep adding a few brush strokes with a very little amount of green and a higher concentration of water, and I look at the whole composition, deciding where to add other leaves lighter in color, where we can eventually add more concentrated pigment, green, in a second moment to create beautiful blends. And at this point, I start using my thin round brush to start to create the center part of these flowers. To do this, I start to use my gouache palette. I mix a little bit of lemon yellow and a little bit of yellow ochre to start to create the center part of these flowers. I use a little bit of gouache instead of watercolor paints because I really want the center part of these flowers to stand out, and gouache is more covering than watercolor, therefore this is my choice. If you don't have gouache available, please go ahead and paint the center part of these flowers with the watercolors you have in your color palette. To create the stamen of these flowers, I'm using the belly, and therefore I'm adding a little bit of pressure to create the central part, and then I'm using just the tip of this brush to create the fine filaments of these flowers. You can proceed in this way, creating all the stamens of all of these flowers. And you can mix the different percentages of, for example, lemon yellow and yellow ochre to obtain different shades and different types of colors that are going to bring together this whole composition. I also added a few contrasting brush strokes in gouache in dark color. In this case, this is a dark brown, just in some areas to allow this color to let the central part of these flowers really pop. And now, with this same brush, I'm mixing a little bit of cobalt green dark, and I start to create layers onto the leaves of this floral composition. I start to add layers when all of the leaves are completely dry, and in this sense we are using what is called wet on dry technique, where basically we are adding strokes when the layer underneath of pigment is completely dry. In this way we are going to be able to completely see these darker elements, these darker brush strokes, and they are going to enhance some areas of the leaves compared to others. In order to add these brush strokes as layers, I sometimes use the tip of my brush when I want to create very fine elements, while instead I use the belly of my brush when I want to create brush strokes that are quite thick in size. When painting in watercolor, I always like to add some contrasting brush strokes, as I am doing now with these elements on the green leaves. I recommend you to do the same, because in this way you will really bring your watercolor painting to life. You can still use all of your watercolor supplies to do this step, or for example you could think of using your gouache colors to add some contrasting brush strokes onto your composition if you'd like. It is up to you how many contrasting brush strokes you want to add and where you want to add them. For example, you could have them also on the petals of your flowers. And so we have reached the end of this tutorial. I really hope that this tutorial was useful and you have learned something new, and especially that you have enjoyed painting with me. Thank you so much!